Like trauma is like a biological experience, a psychological experience, a human experience. That bad things happen to humans. So let's get started. So today's stream is going to be a little bit different. We were planning on streaming Elden Ring, and I was very, very excited about that. But in light of recent events, and what I mean by that is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I just didn't feel it. I felt like there was something else to talk about, which is a little bit more timely and important. I'd love to play Elden Ring. Hopefully I'll play tonight. I was stunned yesterday when it seems like it got released yesterday. So just in light of what's going on, and especially in light of several posts we've seen on our subreddit, I thought I would try to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about post-war trauma and coping. So I think these are topics that are like really important to our community. I think the other thing that I was very surprised by is that we do have people in our community who are from these countries. So when I was at TI of all places, I was really surprised by the number of people who like walked up and introduced themselves and how they had, Ukrainian accents, Russian accents. And so there are a lot of our community. And I think that's going to be an important part of what we talk about, as we'll see. So today, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what we've learned in terms of science about post-war kind of coping. We're going to be sort of basing today's talk on 3 peer-reviewed publications. So one is going to be what we've learned from qualitative research from Holocaust survivors. The second is going to be a paper looking at how people managed to cope in 1999 with a set of air raids, I believe in Serbia. Let me double check. No, Yugoslavia. And then the third study we're going to be kind of talking about, which is really interesting, is going to share a perspective on coping mechanisms and stressors post-traumatic events, which I think is really interesting. It's looking at people from Bosnia, adolescents specifically. So what I'd like to do today is share a little bit about, when we talk about trauma, we don't really understand how trauma affects people. We don't really understand. So a lot of the questions that we're getting is like, what should I do? And I don't know that I'm qualified to tell people what they should do in a situation like this. I really don't feel qualified. And at the same time, I think that we do have, or hopefully we have a responsibility, or we're going to try to educate people about what we understand about how to cope with terrible situations. I have had some degree of clinical experience in this stuff. So the other kind of couple of disclaimers. So the first is that I'm not an expert in trauma. I'm not like a traumatologist. I have not worked very extensively. I mean, I've worked for several months with people who are first responders. So I've done trauma-based programs and things like that, worked with 9/11 survivors, worked with veterans from the Afghanistan and Iraq war. And primarily being a substance use clinician in a lot of ways, like there's a lot of trauma kind of thrown in. But we haven't really dug into how we understand how to cope with trauma too much on stream. So today I'd like to share some information about that. Once again, this is not like a substitute for medical care, right? So we're going to be talking about broad scale principles and like some important kind of takeaways. I don't know that anything we're going to discuss on stream today is like a game plan for how to, survive what's going on in Ukraine right now. I wish, honestly, I could offer that, but the truth is that we just don't know, right? And when it comes to actually dealing with trauma, like this is something that's an individual journey. And what I'd love to do today is share some principles that we've sort of learned in the scientific community and through research about how we understand trauma. Yeah, does that make sense to people? So we're going to kind of dive in. So yeah, I think I'm actually somewhat, in a sense, happy to be talking about this. I know it sounds kind of weird, but I think that we've learned so much from post-war survivors about the process of trauma, which I think like really should like people should understand. So we've learned a lot about coping mechanisms. There's something else that I'm not going to talk about today, which we may, depending on whether y'all find this useful or not or interesting, we may talk a little bit about this sometime next week. But another topic that I was thinking about exploring today is post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic stress. So we know scientifically that like when you experience a traumatic event, that like there's basically a fork in the road and you can go one of two ways. You can kind of grow from the event and like integrate it into who you are and become sort of a stronger, better person. And then the other thing is some people aren't able to cope with it very well and it sort of manifests as post-traumatic stress. And so there's been a lot of really interesting research over the last 20 years about like what determines which path you go on. And I think that kind of information is very, very helpful. A couple of other things that I want to mention. The first is that I know that a lot of people are really struggling right now. I imagine a lot of people are feeling terrified and hopeless. We've certainly seen that on our subreddit. And so one message that I'd have that I completely stand behind is as best as you can, try to hold on to hope as best as you can. I know that in situations like this, and this is as someone who's worked with Holocaust survivors, 9/11 survivors, things can absolutely feel incredibly hopeless in the moment. But the truth is that no human being can predict the future, and we have no idea what's going to come next. And I say that sort of in a good way. I'm optimistic about it. We're going to share a little bit of research from Holocaust survivors today about holding on to hope and trying to manage. I know it sounds really bizarre, but you know sometimes people can feel very, very bad. They can feel even suicidal, hopeless, etc. I encourage y'all to do whatever you can to take care of yourself, do whatever you can to stay safe. If you have access to mental health resources, please use them if they're at your disposal. And I know things can seem really, really bleak right now, but I think we've learned this in the world the past couple of years is like, everyone thought they knew what 2020 was going to be like, right? And then this global pandemic emerged and shattered the way that we lived in this world. And now that the pandemic is ending, we thought we were sort of done with it, right? And then this conflict happens between Russia and Ukraine. And so we never know what's coming. And sometimes that's bad stuff, but it can also be good things. And sometimes it's really, really easy to lose hope. But as best as you can, don't, because you really don't know. And I've seen the work that I've done as a psychiatrist and also the work that I've done here at HG has really helped me appreciate how resilient and amazing human beings are. And we are able to bounce back, and there is kindness in the world. And like there is safety, like you can find safety in this world. You can find security in this world. And even though it may be taken away from you for now, and who knows, I mean, people are undoubtedly going to perish in this conflict. So I can't really say that you're going to be safe for sure. But having worked with trauma survivors, victims for many years now, like I can assure you that, for most people, thankfully, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, right? I can't say for everyone. I'd love to say, I wish I could guarantee you that everything would be safe and happy 5 years from now in your life, but I can't make that guarantee. I don't have the power to do that. I'm not divine. But what I can tell you is that people who hold on to hope are oftentimes not disappointed. And that's a statement that I stand 100% behind. So let's get started. Oh, the last thing that I want to sort of mention is almost like a trigger warning. So some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to do our best to sort of stick to Twitch TOS. So we're going to be citing a couple of scientific peer-reviewed papers. The challenge is that some of the things that are discussed within these papers are actually like quite negative and graphic. We're going to actually steer clear of the most graphic stuff as best as we can, but I'm going to be showing direct quotes from the paper. And so, just in terms of a trigger warning, like I just want y'all to try to, if this is the kind of thing that you think could trigger you, I definitely recommend steering clear or maybe waiting until we have, some kind of edited VOD or something like that. But we are going to be talking about, issues related to war and violence and coping and trauma. So just kind of a trigger warning there. We'll do our best to sort of I'm going to steer clear of some of the worst stuff. but it may get flashed on screen in terms of quotes and things like that. So I apologize for that. Okay, so let's get started. So today what we're going to talk a little bit about is what we've learned from as a scientific community about post-war coping and sort of how to survive, or what factors predict kind of healthy integration from traumatic experiences. And so once again, this is the kind of thing where I wish I could give you all a script and say, if you do A, B, and C, if you do D, E, and F, that you will be fine. But we can't really say that fairly. And that I think is okay, because what I'm going to share with you all today is some basic principles about what we understand about how to cope with negative situations. So when researchers look at people like Holocaust survivors, post-war survivors, adolescents, and development, like what are the things that constitute, or what can we sort of determine from research by looking at masses of people, like what helps people cope, what helps people survive, and what helps people integrate. So the first study that we're going to look at is going to be a qualitative study of Holocaust survivors. Okay, so, and I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about why we're sort of focusing on this study. So this is a study that looks at immediate post-war coping strategies of adolescent survivors of the Holocaust. The other thing that we're going to be focusing on today is going to be primarily looking at studies of younger populations. So I think a lot of people in our community are young. So we sort of focused on younger populations. So if we look at Holocaust survivors, what are the coping mechanisms which they employed that seem to matter? So this is a qualitative study. So what that means is that this person essentially did interviews with a small sample of people and basically asked them questions about what their experience of the Holocaust was, what they felt was helpful in terms of coping. And we're going to kind of go over some of those kind of key takeaways that this person sort of discovered. Okay? So the first thing is that we have to understand the population that we're dealing with. So these are people who lost everything. We're talking about Holocaust survivors. A lot of them fled to Poland. Even in Poland, they experienced a lot of persecution, sometimes violence, racism, anti-Semitism. And this is one of the things that's really, really challenging about post-war refugees, is that the trauma doesn't necessarily stop when you escape the country. And I know that that sounds like really hopeless. There's good news there too, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not like once you leave the danger zone, like you're free of danger. That even when you go somewhere else, there's a foreign language, there may be foreign people, there may be there may be racism or other issues, but that these people essentially lost everything. So they lost family, they lost friends, they lost, homes, they left pictures behind, memories. They got separated from people. So these people have been through something just incredibly, incredibly challenging. So I'm going to just share a quick quote. So we're going to just go down to page 3. So how can you feel hopeful when you don't know where to go? You don't know for what to go. We were just not human. I was so broken down after we were liberated. More than being in the concentration camps, I suffered emotional. I missed my oldest sister with her little boy, whom I loved. I missed my friend. This was my first love in my youth. When we were liberated, I said, where should I go? Why should I live? The interesting thing is that people also expressed, in addition to feeling hopeless, people expressed gratitude for being alive and free. So we were maybe more enthusiastic than before the war, because to go through such pains and hunger and all kinds of troubles for those years, all of a sudden you became a human being again, and you have everything you need. Just not to breathe the German air was great. We lived in a group home that the Jewish agency provided. We had no clothes, but our needs were so limited. We were just glad to be free and breathe, and no one to tell you what to do. So, and we'll kind of get to this in a second, but I think that's going to be a common theme for today, and hopefully that doesn't rub people the wrong way. We're always open to your feedback, but I think it's normal for people to feel hopeless and confused in these situations, not know where they're supposed to go or why they should go anywhere or why they should continue living. And at the same time, like after you sort of work through that for a little while or live through that, many people, I would even say the majority of people, are even able to find light and hope and some sense of relief and joy, and to be able to rebuild lives after the end of it. So here's one of the key things that the study found. The first step to overcoming trauma is safety. So when we think about emotional processing, doing this kind of work, like, making meaning, we'll kind of get to all these other steps. But one of the things that's been borne out in research over and over and over again is like all that crap comes later. The first thing that you need is to be safe. And you can't really do any of the work of trauma processing as long as you are in an unsafe situation. And this is where, unfortunately, there have been a couple of studies that have shown that like intensive psychological debriefing in the midst of trauma has actually had some detrimental effects. So we'll talk about trauma processing a little bit later. So trauma processing from psychotherapists, for example, can be helpful or harmful. And that's a whole different discussion. But essentially, prior to reconstruction, prior to remembrance, and prior to reconnection, which are sort of the steps in one model of trauma processing. So the first is we have to make sense of the event. And then this also involves like rebuilding our lives to a certain degree, right? Moving to a new country, making social connections. We'll kind of get to that in a second. So we have to reconstruct our lives, and both internally and externally. The next thing that we have to do is remember in some way. So this is the process of mourning, acceptance, letting go. And this can be incredibly difficult, right? So if we think about Holocaust survivors, for example, like they're never going to get to go to their home again, right? The home that they grew up in, presumably. And we don't really know if that's ever going to happen. And then finally, what we sort of want in terms of trauma processing is reconnection. So this is when we sort of form relationships. We kind of fully reconnect with life. And hopefully at this point, we're able to live a completely normal and fulfilling life. But you can't do any of these things in an unsafe environment. So this is where like safety has to come first. And this is where, unfortunately, like even in the post-war environments, as we sort of already mentioned, just because you're out of the immediate danger zone doesn't mean that you're necessarily safe. There can be concerns about shelter. There can be concerns about racism, physical violence, sexual violence. So safety has to come first. So the first thing is, try to be safe, and don't worry about trauma processing or anything like that. Like you just, safety absolutely comes first. This also goes for anyone out there who's kind of struggling and feeling unsafe in terms of suicidal thoughts or hurting someone else. I strongly encourage you to, as best as you can, get some kind of support over that. And safety really does come first. So this is kind of interesting. So after looking at that, the next thing that people sort of noticed is that what people need next is community. So here's a kind of another quote that we're going to share. So these are three people that they interviewed. Judah, Rivka, and Ruth clearly articulate these group living arrangements as an attempt to recreate family. After such a test we went through, everybody was happy to be alive, even though that life had not too much meaning without families. But we had so many friends who were in the same situation. We somehow lived together and got close. Very seldom that somebody had a family, a father, a mother, or brothers. They were all single survivors, or maybe two brothers from one family that survived or something like that. Then this is how we got back on track of living. What happens when you have no family, you form families. And a lot of people started eating together. And it's a normal life, but it's not a normal life, but it's the best you can do, like communes. I had no family, but I made family. Survivors need to be among their own people for support in the early recovery period, but this did not necessarily help the grieving process. So we'll kind of get into that in a second. But this is where the second thing that people need is community. And this is why actually I'm really proud of like our community. So, when people post on our subreddit and things like that, it's like, I don't want to underestimate like the value of those kinds of things. Like I know it feels small and I know it feels insignificant. I'm going to tear up a little bit, but, but like, I think that these things do matter. And like the research actually suggests that it's not deep trauma processing with a traumatologist that these people need right away. The first thing that they need is to be safe. And the second thing that they need is like a sense of community and a sense of family. And we're going to kind of show a couple of other quotes about that. But like, this is incredibly important. When it comes to mental health, it's more than the treatment of mental illness. Like there are some very, very basic things that human beings need in order for their mental health to be like good, right? And one of those core things is like connection with other human beings. And so we see this with Holocaust survivors. It'll be a theme throughout the day. And it's something that I hope our community can provide. I'm not saying that it's any substitute for certainly not mental health treatment and certainly not family. But like in whatever way we can, we should support the members of our community. I know it may feel insignificant, but this is the kind of thing we'll talk about this towards the end as well, about sort of like cumulative risk factors and cumulative protective factors, where we don't really know what's going to help or what may be insignificant. But like as best as we can as a community, we need to support people who are struggling and try to be there for them. Because the truth is that community actually does matter quite a lot. So, so this is also where even when it comes to sort of dealing with like the post-traumatic experiences, this paper sort of talks a little bit about how people like, I'll just kind of read this, but I know that by that time I had nobody left. I'm alone except for my cousins. We tried to keep busy, but because I had nobody, I became very hard. I didn't leave my emotions that I should cry to someone because they all lost family. I wasn't the only one. They were in the same situation. So we tried not to grieve, but separately in my heart, I did. So perhaps, so it is hard to ascertain from Rivka's account whether her decision to grieve separately in her heart rather than share her emotions with other survivors who were also grieving from within or from observing how others around her were behaving. Perhaps it was a little bit of both. So we tried not to grieve seems to imply an unspoken group norm. So this is where, it's kind of interesting because like people weren't necessarily actively going through the grieving process. It was something that they, it was something that they sort of formed a community and sometimes kind of talked about and sometimes sort of didn't talk about. They also formed displaced person communities. So this was sort of, as they like, these are almost like refugee camps or things like that, like places where they had hospitals and where people sort of got together. And this community aspect was really, really like an important part of their healing and their growth and their coping. Interesting thing here is that once again, they didn't explicitly talk about emotions very much, which we'll sort of see as a theme. And in my experience, kind of trauma processing doesn't need to be forced. It sort of happens at its own pace. So this is where things get a little bit tricky. So the other important like coping strategy that people used was actually like anger, dealing with injustice. And what I'm going to actually do is, instead of just quoting this, I'm going to move this over here so I can write at the same time. So this is where another way that people do cope is by sort of like getting angry. So there are instances where when dealing with issues of racism, people would sort of like or anti-Semitism, people would kind of lash out. There are also cases in this qualitative interview of some of the trauma survivors engaging in violent behavior. We don't really advocate for that. And even the authors of the paper sort of suggest that engaging in violent behavior against other people who are maybe being anti-Semitic or racist may be a short-term coping strategy, but probably doesn't lead to like long-term improvement. So this is where, anger can sort of be productive or unproductive. So let me just read another kind of quote here. I'm going to try to steer clear of showing this stuff on stream. So the agency and anger expressed by survivors after the war were channeled in both productive and non-productive ways. Anger was taken to the extreme by a few people. And some people sort of found that like even doing small things like stealing from their oppressors or things like that helped them kind of cope and get a sense of justice. So the researchers sort of suggest that I would hypothesize that such acts were only temporary salves for their wounds. They may have been effective as short-term coping strategies, but there's little evidence to suggest that these men are at peace with themselves in the long term as a result of their actions. So and this is where what we're going to talk a little bit about now is like forgiveness. So this is where in trauma theory, there's sometimes an emphasis for forgiveness, that in order to let go and process your trauma, in order to accept, what you kind of have to do is forgive, right? So like the good thing to do, it's like healthy to forgive. Okay? So forgiveness is a key part, and like even in terms of some trauma groups will have kind of anger management components where we encourage people to forgive, to accept. And that moving past your anger is like an important part of this reconstitution of a healthy identity. It's important to point out, though, that this is like somewhat disputed and that other clinicians actually don't believe that forgiveness is necessary. In fact, some clinicians will argue that forgiveness is actually unattainable in a very practical sense. So if we're thinking about, war-related atrocities or physical violence, emotional violence, sexual violence, it can actually be quite toxic to try to get someone to forgive. So there are some downsides to forgiveness. So sometimes in the process of forgiveness, what we actually do is exacerbate feelings of low self-worth. And you'll see this if people kind of get pressured to forgive, right? Because then like what happens, like I've seen this a lot, unfortunately, in unhealthy family situations where people will be like pressured to forgive, right? Oh, like it was a mistake. They've learned their lesson. Like you should forgive so that the family can move on and heal. And so what happens is that there's sort of this burden placed on the victim of forgiving. And if they're not able to, then like the family family unit suffers. And like this kind of thing can actually be like bad, right? Because what it can sort of, if I'm not able to forgive, let's say that I was abused by, a parent or uncle or something like that, physically, emotionally, whatever. And so then if I'm not able to forgive, I start to think like lower of myself, like, oh, why can't I forgive? Everyone is saying I should forgive. I should be able to forgive because there's this camp up here, right? Which is saying that, oh, the way to move on with your life is to forgive. And so some clinicians have actually found, and I kind of fall into this camp as well, that forgiveness is not a necessary part. I think acceptance is, but that forgiveness is purely, no one is entitled to forgiveness. It's purely the person who is the victim gets to decide. That's personally where I kind of stand. The other thing is that people may not be able to. Right? So depending on what's done to you, I'm not so sure that someone who's fleeing the Ukraine right now will ever be able to forgive someone who's taken away family members, homes, etc. Right? Like they may not be able to. It's not like human beings don't have an endless capacity to forgive, very practically speaking. Now, if you want to talk about on the spiritual sense and things like that, maybe you can make an argument that to grow as a human being, you should have, the closer you get to endless forgiveness, the more positive of a person you become. But I don't know that that's necessarily true from like a scientific perspective or a trauma healing perspective. The last reason that we want to, so forgiveness, the last kind of thing is that sometimes it's actually very disempowering for the victim. Right? So like, it's kind of interesting here, but, so like you can sometimes disempower the survivor while having the effect of like empowering the perpetrator. Right? Because if you sort of are forced to forgive or you end up forgiving, then you're kind of like wiping that away in a sense. The other person sort of gets to walk away from it. They're kind of feeling good about themselves. There are several papers that have sort of talked about this. The point here, at least for the purpose of this kind of lecture, is that forgiveness can be good and it can not be good. And this is where trauma is like very complicated, right? There are individual circumstances, individual people with different personality traits, different coping mechanisms. And should you consider forgiveness? Absolutely. Do you need to accept and reintegrate what has happened to you into your life? Absolutely. But do you need to forgive? Not necessarily. And so I think that's where like it's complicated and it's nuanced, and there isn't a simple answer that Dr. K can give you in a lecture. And that the desire to forgive or the need to forgive or the need not to forgive is something that you as an individual need to decide. And the good news is that both roads can lead to healing, presuming you kind of do it well enough. Okay? The last thing is a sense of justice. So this is what I thought was really interesting about the paper, is that what they sort of focused on were things that were like ultimately like non-clinical in terms of coping strategies. So some people, some people who were survivors like really, really like felt that a part of their healing process was watching the Nuremberg trials. Some people took things into their own hands, which we don't advocate for at all. So I personally don't advocate for violence in pretty much any case. But I think that the pursuit of justice is like a completely different matter, right? So when there are institutions and rules that we should abide by to sort of get justice, that's totally fine. And so a lot of people did feel a sense of closure and kind of like completion with through things like the Nuremberg trials. And so the last thing that I kind of want to talk a little bit about was hope. So I'm going to read this quote to y'all. Generally, the survivors were full of hope regarding their new lives. Those who were married were eager to start in a new land. The rest, with the exception of Ruth, who was all alone, had some surviving family members with whom they could emigrate. Many of the survivors' first choice was Israel, but wasn't always possible. So here are a couple of quotes. We wanted to go anywhere, just get away from Germany. And when my wife became pregnant, I said, uh-oh. Now I'm the father of a child not yet born, and to go to Palestine was already too dangerous. I'm not responsible only for myself. I'm now responsible for a wife and child. So then we registered for America. I wish we had gone to Israel, but we couldn't. I did not want to go illegal in any way, and also I didn't want to go into another war. We would have gone on the Exodus, But my husband and sisters here, we went to America. And some of the survivors adjusted quite quickly to the new life in America and Canada. I was young. I didn't mind going. I was happy. And when I came to America, I felt really very good. I felt free. It's a free country, and I felt wonderful here. It was tough, but it was paradise, Nobody was trying to kill you. You always had something to wear, something to eat. I mean, it's a haven. And so the key thing here is like, I know that things can feel really hopeless, but I think we can sort of acknowledge that the Holocaust is one of the most grueling things that people have had to live through, and that people can come out the other end with hope. And that presumably, as people sort of engaged in safety, in community, to a certain degree, kind of managing their anger and seeking justice, that at the end of the day, hope is possible. Rebuilding a life is possible. And I know that if you're someone who's kind of caught in the middle of a traumatic situation, that the mind looks at our current situation and kind of expects the worst, predicts the worst. That's sort of a survival mechanism, right? So as human beings, we have to think about worst case scenarios. It's what our brains are kind of designed to do in order to protect us. And at the same time, just because your brain is thinking about a worst case scenario doesn't necessarily mean that that thing is going to happen. And this is where I've just seen time and time again, like how resilient the human spirit can be. So the next paper we're going to talk about is a little bit different. So this is a paper that's looking at, let me tell you all the exact population. So this is a paper that looks at civilians during the air attacks of Yugoslavia in 1999. So this is a paper that we're going to kind of cover very briefly that talks about coping strategies for that people use. So now if we have a traumatic event, okay, what people sort of look at is, if I have a traumatic event, do I develop PTSD? And the answer is that in here, there's all kinds of stuff, right? So even with a shared event, if we have one traumatic event, we may develop PTSD for this person, but not for this person. So you could go this way or you could go this way. And what's the difference? And it turns out that how you cope is a really, really important part of the development of psychiatric symptoms, or not necessarily even a clinical diagnosis, but how you manage and what your life ends up being has a lot to do with coping. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about coping and sort of what some people sort of discovered. So the first is that, so when they were looking at the Yugoslavia air attacks, in 1999, what they found is that different people, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about this, but that different people use different primary coping strategies. So there were a bunch of different coping strategies people used, like humor, talking with each other. They even used leisure activities. So there are like 8 or 9 different coping strategies that people used. But what we're going to sort of do, and this is going to is zero in on a couple of those. So one group used predominantly leisure activities. And what we sort of found here is that people who use predominantly leisure activities had sort of had a low amount of intrusive thoughts. So this is a correlation. So this is something that was studied after the fact, which is important to understand. And that people who spent a lot of time talking, debriefing, discussing what they had gone through had a higher level of intrusive thoughts. The other thing that's important here is that some of these effects are also modified by gender. So whether you go this, like, so when you have a traumatic event and use coping strategy 1, and you are male versus female, versus coping strategy number 2. If you are male versus female, you actually get different effects. So this can lead to, a positive thing or a negative thing. This can lead to a negative thing or a positive thing. And the reason that I sort of highlight this is just because, like, this just goes to show that, like, trauma is not simple. It's not as simple as, okay, for a given traumatic event, if I do this, then I will be fine, versus doing this is bad, right? There are all kinds of different variables that go into this, which we'll sort of present in more detail later. The other thing that's important to remember about studies like this is these are correlational. So if we say that people who engaged in leisure activities had fewer intrusive thoughts, does that mean that leisure activities reduce, so question for you, Twitch chat, does this mean that leisure activities reduce intrusive thoughts? Does that mean that talking increases intrusive thoughts? No, absolutely not, right? So this is where correlation does not imply causation, which is something that I find the majority of the world doesn't really appreciate. So what this could mean is that the people who had fewer intrusive thoughts were maybe more able to engage in leisure activities. And maybe the people who had more intrusive thoughts were the ones who were like kind of forced to talk about it more, right? So correlations don't necessarily imply causation, which is a really, really important point. That's really what I wanted to illustrate here. So even when we're talking about some of this research, you know, as I'm drawing conclusions, or as I'm sort of drawing conclusions for y'all, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that these conclusions are like very preliminary in nature and we shouldn't read too much into them. So this paper also sort of sets up some of these details, which now I'm going to talk about in more detail here. So what I'd like to share kind of towards the end is a perspective on how to think about trauma. So here's what I sort of want to point out. So this is a study that looked at Bosnian adolescents, and I think it may be 555 people in Bosnia. And so what we sort of discover is there's a traumatic event. So this is kind of the cycle of trauma. And then after a traumatic event, we have post-war stressors. Based on the post-war stressors, we employ coping strategies, right? So different kinds of things can happen to you after a traumatic event. And then based on the coping strategies that we use for the stressor that we deal with, we can sort of end up with a certain way of gauging stress response. So this is kind of the outcome, okay? So actually, I'm going to go ahead and move this around a little bit because I think I'm going to need more space. So if people ask, how do I deal with trauma? Okay? If someone asks the question, how do I deal with trauma? This is where I'd say, like, this is why it's complicated. This is why working with a professional can be really, really good, right? Because it's not as simple as, oh, I should do this, or I should do this, or I should do this. And at the same time, I think it is important. Why? Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So this is where, like, it kind of gets complicated, but I'd love to illustrate this for y'all. So this is a paper that looked at, let's just define our population because this is really important too. So this paper looked at predicting adolescent post-traumatic stress in the aftermath of war. And the population they looked at is the vast majority of youth who lived through the Bosnian War were exposed to multiple traumatic events, including interpersonal violence, community destruction, and the loss of a loved one. This study examined factors that predict post-war psychological adjustment, specifically post-traumatic stress in Bosnian adolescents, okay? So the first thing that this paper sort of realizes is that after a traumatic event, there are different kinds of triggers that people have. So the first is trauma reminders. The second is loss reminders. Okay. And the third is what we call secondary adversities. And these are things like family conflict. Okay? So what this sort of means is that, like, after a war, if we really think about what do we have to deal with as a human being, like what happens in our psychology? Like, it's not just that initial event, right? It's all of the other things that happen after that. So one thing that this paper sort of highlights, and other papers have approved this, is that sensory experiences are strong triggers as opposed to, like, memory. So what does this mean? Or kind of visual stuff. So what this means is that the strong trauma reminders, the things that really invoke that kind of trauma memory, are like deeply sensory experiences. So these are things like smells, sounds. So I've seen this a lot where, when I work with like post-war veterans, what I find is that, like, it's like noises, like car mufflers going off, doors slamming that really remind them of like gunshots or explosive devices or things like that. And that's actually what really kind of like triggers them. So interestingly enough, what the paper found is that, watching stuff on TV, like seeing pictures of like your country is not as triggering as like a particular smell or a particular sound or things like that. Okay. So the second thing that people, they sort of talked about is loss reminders. So this is like pictures of loved ones or like activities that you used to do. So if I lost, a parent in the war and we used to go fishing, when I go fishing, that sort of counts as a loss reminder. And so these are the different things that can kind of like trigger, some kind of traumatic response, some kind of traumatic stress. And remember, based on this trigger, there are different coping strategies. And we'll sort of see how different coping strategies result in like alterations in the stress response. The last thing is family conflict. So this is really, really big. So increased responsibility. This one is huge. So a lot of times what happened with these Bosnian war survivors is you had adolescents who were thrust into a role of responsibility for the family. I'm a 16-year-old kid who suddenly now is like the man of the household, right? So dad is no longer around, so I have to step up. I'm responsible for physical protection. I'm responsible for financial protection. I'm responsible for all kinds of things. And so there's a large sense of burden. And this is incredibly stressful in terms of like creating, stress responses. So what we sort of find in terms of stress responses is people will measure hyperarousal. So these are different things that we'll measure for PTSD. Remember that just because you have some of these things does not necessarily mean that you have PTSD. PTSD is a clinical diagnosis. So even in this paper, what they're sort of doing is looking at attributes that may be parts of the stress response, which may or may not directly link to a diagnosis. So hyperarousal, avoidance, re-experiencing, that's like a flashback, and numbing. And so the key thing here about this paper, this is what's really cool about it, is if you're trying to figure out like, okay, if I've had a traumatic event and these are my triggers, what predicts whether hyperarousal is high or low? What predicts whether avoidance is high or low? What predicts whether re-experiencing is high or low? What predicts whether my feeling of numbness is high or low? It turns out that there's a variable amount of coping strategies. So there's variation in what kind of coping strategy you employ that correlates with like how your stress response is. Okay? So let's talk about coping. So, do I do this here? Let me do this here. So in terms of coping, we're going to divide coping strategies into a couple of buckets. Okay? The first is engaging coping strategies, and the second is disengaging coping strategies. So disengaging coping strategies include denial, avoidance, or wishful thinking. Okay? So when we experience something bad, we can cope by disengaging from the bad thing. So I'm going to like pretend it's not real. La, 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 la. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. I can avoid the thing entirely, right? So I experience this. I'm not saying that what I've gone through is anywhere near what Bosnian war refugees have gone through. But I remember personally like doing my best to avoid going to Spanish class, not checking my email, not looking at my syllabus when I was failing out, right? So this is like applies to serious trauma, but also the small struggles we have in life. Sometimes what we also do is wishful thinking. So a large group of our community is very concerned about maladaptive daydreaming. So we've talked about maladaptive daydreaming. I think we have a video on YouTube about it. There's also the fantasy trap from Dr. K's guide, which sort of goes into this. But that's absolutely a coping strategy, right? Is to disengage from the thing that's bothering you. Now, in terms of engaging coping strategies, there are two types. The first is a primary coping strategy, in which we directly react to what we feel. And then there's a secondary coping strategy in which we adapt to what we feel. Now, this may sound kind of the same, but we'll kind of go into more details. But like when we experience something emotionally, like we have reactions to it, right? So if I'm feeling something emotionally, I can use emotional expression I can literally vent my feelings. Okay? I can use problem solving to a certain degree. This kind of confuses me a little bit, but it's classified as a primary coping mechanism. And then we can also use emotional regulation strategies. So I think the key thing here is these are like direct ways to react to what's going on internally. Then the secondary coping strategies are adaptive in nature. So that's like not necessarily dealing with the emotion, but how do I integrate this emotion into the rest of my life? So this involves more cognitive stuff. This involves like acceptance. This involves things like cognitive restructuring. This is like making meaning or finding meaning out of what happens to you. This also includes distraction, and I think there's like some confusion here between like avoidance and distraction. But remember that like avoidance is sort of subconscious. Distraction is like intentional, right? So if I am having a rough day at work, I can sort of like say, okay, you know what? I'm going to like take a break from work, and in an hour, I'm going to intentionally like play Elden Ring. I'm going to play Lost Ark. Whereas avoidance is sort of like mindlessly going into games and stuff and like watching YouTube or whatever and like just avoiding the whole problem. Whereas distraction is sort of an intentional adaptation, okay? And the two are very different. Like you may think like, okay, but can you play games? And that's why like gaming, for example, can be a healthy coping mechanism or an unhealthy coping mechanism. And sometimes people will ask the question, okay, how do I know if gaming is a healthy coping mechanism or unhealthy coping mechanism? There are lots of answers to that question, but what I really love about this formulation of trauma, stress response, triggers, and coping is that we can draw the distinction between the intentionality of gaming. Are you using it actively as an adaptation? Or are you using it as a way of disengaging? Okay? So what we sort of discover is that based on what you do for one of these things, the coping strategy you employ actually results in different symptoms, okay? Or different like levels of stress response. So let's take a look at this. So if you have a trauma reminder, like you have like let's say I smell something, right? And if I use a primary engaging coping mechanism, this is, remember, this is like emotional expression, regulation, okay? Or regulation. What this does is essentially like improve just about everything, okay? So this is going to lead to improvements in all of these four categories, okay? Yeah, I think so. So we sort of see this in terms of like sensory grounding and mindfulness, right? So like when I have someone who is really, really struggling and emotionally very activated, we know that engaging in mindfulness techniques, which is sort of directly dealing with our emotions, regulating our emotions, we know that, for example, mindfulness techniques can affect our sympathetic tone, so the amount of adrenaline that's flowing through our body, that this actually has positive effects, I think, on all four of these dimensions. We may be missing one dimension. The interesting thing is that secondary engaging, so this is adaptation. So if we try to like make sense of things, cognitive restructure, accept what's going on, this has positive effects on everything except for avoidance. So this is where we get a positive here, we get a positive here, we get a positive here, okay? The problem is that, let me just make sure. So hyperarousal. Yeah, so everything except for avoidance. So it seems like, you know, primarily engaging can help us with avoidance, but secondary engaging adaptations may not actually do that. And then the third thing that we've got is disengagement. And what it looks like is that disengagement basically doesn't help with anything. So disengagement actually makes things worse in all dimensions. Okay? And so this is where it's kind of like interesting. But so what we can sort of take away from this is if we're thinking about, okay, let's say that you've been through a traumatic event and you're trying to figure out, how should I cope? What are good coping strategies? And the key thing that I want y'all to take away from this is that like coping is a complicated process, right? So coping involves, first of all, like recognizing that there are different triggers and that the way that we respond to those triggers will ultimately determine like our final stress response, and that there isn't, a good coping strategy, or like there's not an ideal coping strategy. And this is precisely why, like, if you have been through a traumatic experience, you should work with a trained professional if you can. Because this is where like trained professionals recognize, this is why you go to a professional, is because like they recognize that, okay, not all of these three things are the same. The actual work with trauma involves ideally a clinician sort of going through this stuff and sort of trying to figure out, okay, what are your triggers? What are the different coping strategies we can use, right? So in psychotherapy, you may like have an adaptation or make sense of it. Man's Search for Meaning, which is a book written by Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor, I think is just like an epic version of a secondary engaging coping mechanism, right? So he like made sense of the world. And this is where, I think like you can use, the evidence sort of suggests that you just need some kind of framework. It's not that one framework is better than another framework. So the framework that I tend to use is a very karmic framework. It's sort of like recognizing that, your actions have consequences, and that things that happen to you happen for a reason, and how can we make sense of this? It's not to say that necessarily that the theory of karma is true. It's not about it being right or wrong. It's about it being functional. So some people will use stoicism. Some people will use religion. Some people will use psychology. The main thing is not that that one kind of adaptive model is like better than the others. It's that you as an individual need to figure out like what is the adaptive model you want to use? What makes sense to you about the world? Do you want to take a karmic approach? Do you want to take a stoic approach? Do you want to take a, like body keeps the score scientific approach? Do you want to lean on religious traditions? Do you want to lean on family traditions? Like, how do you want to manage this? But at the end of the day, it seems like the three major options for coping strategies are to react to our emotions or deal with our emotions in sort of a reactive way. Like, how do we emotionally regulate? How do we emotionally express? How do we solve problems around the emotional things that we have? There's a secondary type of engagement, which is how do we adapt to what we experience? How do we make sense of things? How do we cognitively restructure? How do we determine what this means for me in my life? So a good example of this is like, I think cancer survivors do this. The oncology does this really well with cancer survivors, where like we sort of talk about being a cancer survivor or a trauma survivor as like a part of our identity, right? We make it a part of our identity, and then we start doing fundraising and we start supporting other people who have cancer and things like that. So that's like an example of like a secondary engaging coping mechanism where I'm going to adapt to this. I'm going to make it a part of who I am. And like, that's okay. Like, it doesn't have to, even though it becomes a part of my identity, it doesn't have to be like a bad thing in my identity. We see that as well with trauma survivors as well, as they engage in peer support services, as they, as you have these refugees, these Jewish refugees that are coming from Germany to the United States and Canada, you have local people who are Jewish who will then like support those people. And then like, as you as a trauma survivor begin to heal, you start to support other people. And that's where this sort of adaptation comes in. And the last option is we do have disengaging possibilities, right? We have avoidance, we have denial, we have wishful thinking, and those tend to exacerbate or not do very well in terms of like managing the stress response. This too is something that I don't necessarily think that just because these are not great for you in the moment doesn't mean that you can't employ them. So as a clinician, what I would say is that like, you have to start where you are, and the process of taking unhealthy coping mechanisms and developing healthy coping mechanisms is like challenging and kind of an uphill battle. It can absolutely be done, but be patient with yourself, right? Don't just beat yourself up if you're using disengaging coping mechanisms. So just to kind of summarize, I know we were supposed to stream Elden Ring today, but I felt like in light of everything that's going on and some of the messages that I've seen from our community, I just didn't really feel like playing games on stream today. And instead, what I tried to do very briefly is talk a little bit about what we understand from post-war studies of people who have been through traumatic events. So a couple of key takeaways. The first is that by doing deep qualitative research with Holocaust survivors, we recognize that there are 4 major aspects to coping. The first is that you need to be safe. So none of the work of processing can really happen. You can't really reconstruct, you can't remember, and you can't reconnect unless you're safe. The second thing is that community is incredibly important, right? So if people are trying to figure out what should I do, just first of all, try to get safe. Secondly, like try to engage in some kind of community-driven activity, right? So like connect with other human beings. Don't worry about processing your trauma or whatever. The next thing, I mean, you can if you want to. If you're ready to, by all means, go for it. Next thing that's important is to acknowledge that anger and forgiveness are like an important part of this equation. There isn't a clear answer here. Some people like to act on their anger. We don't really recommend that at all. At the same time, remember that forgiveness is a complicated issue, and sometimes there's a bias towards like forgiving being a part of the trauma healing process. I think that's true for some people, but it doesn't have to be true for everyone, and it's okay to not forgive. The last thing is seeking justice. So this is where, you know, if we just look at the data, getting some kind of justice in terms of people who have wronged you can be very healing in terms of trauma. So to find people who have attacked you to, you know, be held to justice, that the Nuremberg trials were actually like very like trauma healing for Holocaust survivors. Last thing to kind of point out is that we also know from several studies that psychological debriefing can be helpful or hurtful depending on the circumstance. So we know that there's overwhelming evidence that therapy for trauma can be very, very good. But we also have studies that show that psychological debriefing, especially immediately after a trauma, can actually have the opposite effect. So how should you know whether you should engage in therapy or not? That sort of depends on you and depends on what your experience is, right? So if you're really struggling, if you're feeling suicidal, if you're feeling hopeless, I strongly encourage you to go see a mental health professional, but also don't feel obligated to see someone if you don't feel comfortable with it. So my overwhelming experience working with trauma is that it should be done at the pace of the person, right? So me as the clinician, I don't say, we're going to dig into your trauma today, and you dig and you dig and you dig. No, like you let the person decide and dictate what happens. So if you feel like you're ready to see a therapist, you should absolutely go do that. If you feel like you're not quite ready, that's totally fine too. It doesn't hurt to get an evaluation. Next thing that we sort of talked about is that there are differential effects of coping mechanisms. That depending on what you're dealing with, how you respond to it can affect the stress response that you experience. So we talked a little bit about leisure activities versus processing. We talked a little bit about correlation versus causation. So we also have to be careful because just because we demonstrate that a particular coping activity, such as leisure activity as opposed to talking about it, leads to less experiencing of kind of stress-related stuff, may not mean that I should just try to have fun, right? Because there could be a chicken or egg problem there where the reason that people are able to engage in leisure activities is because they've sort of processed their trauma a little bit better already. The last thing that we talked about, and this I thought is really, really interesting, is a model for understanding how to cope with different trauma. And there are a couple of important parts to this model. The first is that after a traumatic event, the actual post-war stressors can be varied. So some people may experience a particular kind of stressor. Other people may experience a different kind of stressor. So in looking at Bosnian adolescents, we found that some people experience very, very like sensory trauma triggers, whereas other people experienced a large sense of burden and family conflict. Like, oh my God, I have to take care of my family now. And that sort of made it difficult to sleep. It made them more avoidant. It made them feel numb. So the kinds of things that you experience are going to be individualized. Furthermore, that coping strategies are not all the same, that we have engaging coping strategies, which involve primary engagement, which is sort of defined as reacting to emotion. So emotional regulation, emotional expression, to a certain degree, emotional problem solving. So that's like directly reacting to what you feel. And we have adaptive coping strategies, which are sort of like not directly reacting to it, but making sense of it and integrating it into other parts of your life. So these include things like cognitive restructuring, acceptance, and other like more global stuff, right? It's like micro versus macro coping strategy. And then we also have disengaging coping strategies, which a lot of people use, like avoidance, denial, and even like wishful thinking or fantasy. And generally speaking, what we find is that depending on what your problem is and what coping strategy you employ, you're going to create a different effect on your like stress level. So how hyper aroused you are, how numb you are, how much you re-experience, how you sleep, all of those things are going to be a confluence of what your triggers are and what your coping strategies are. The key thing here is that there isn't one formula for trauma. I wish I could say, hey, if you're in the Ukraine and you're fleeing right now, do A, B, and C, and you'll be fine. But I can't say that. I don't think anyone can say that. Trauma and the experience of trauma, dealing with trauma, coping with trauma is an individualized journey that is so complicated. At the same time, I want y'all to understand that there is a way forward, right? We're understanding more and more about this. Just because I can't give you an answer in 1 hour about what you should do does not mean that there is not an answer out there. Does not mean that you are going to be feeling this way for the rest of your life. Does not mean that the world is a hopeless place. I know it feels that way right now, and I'm not even going to say that you're wrong in thinking that, right? Because I can't even imagine what it's like to have the city that I live in shelled by missiles, right? Like I've never experienced anything like that. So if you feel hopeless, like I can only imagine what that feels like. At the same time, I want to say that if we really do look at the research, that there is hope, that that human beings are incredibly resilient, that human beings can find a way to find happiness and sort of reintegrate into society and enjoy things again, right? And like, I truly do believe that. It's part of the reason that I do the work that I do. And the more that I do the work that I do, and this is kind of the weird paradoxical thing, you know, a lot of times people think it's hard to be a psychiatrist. Because like, don't all of these people weigh you down and listening to everyone? Like, sure, emotional burnout can be a problem. But the more I've worked in this way, the more inspired I am by humanity. And the more that you really see like, holy crap, this person has been through so much. How on earth are they able to get out of bed in the morning and like do anything? And the more that I've worked with people, the more I've seen like, honestly, like human beings are way more, possess so much more strength and resilience than like I had any idea of. And you don't see that until you see a human being who has been tested. And so like, oddly enough, I feel humbled and amazed by what humans are capable of. And it's given me hope that despite how terrible of the world, how terrible the world can feel at times, that like I have hope, and that doesn't come from my own journeys, right? Because I've had it easy for the most part in life. If I had struggles, sure, but nothing on the order of magnitude of like Holocaust survivors or what's going on in the Ukraine, or like people who survived air raids in Yugoslavia in 1999. And like when I talk to those people, when I talk to people who are first responders from 9/11, and when I talk to people who have fought in the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and when I work with those people, those are the people that inspire me and give me hope. Because I've seen it time and time and time again. So if you're out there and you're listening and you're feeling hopeless, I totally get it. It's not my place to say that you shouldn't be hopeless. And at the same time, I can say that I have faith that it is possible for your life to be better tomorrow. And that's something that I will completely stand behind. That's it. Questions, I guess. Yeah, so this is a good question. How should we think about our own struggles, considering that there are people who are going through a war right now? I know it sounds kind of weird, but like trauma and struggling is not a competition. So I've seen this, unfortunately, in like, you know, trauma therapy groups that I've run and stuff like that, where sometimes there's like a competitive nature. And the competitive nature can be like bad for both people. So some people will invalidate their own trauma because someone else has been through worse. And someone else will feel almost arrogant because I have the worst trauma, therefore I am entitled to the most compassion. I don't think that comparison of what we struggle with is useful at all, right? So like the struggles what you're dealing with is legitimate. It doesn't change your life just because someone else is struggling with something worse, right? So, I mean, I recognize I just made a comparison because I haven't lived through that. So I can acknowledge that, but it doesn't mean that like I'm not deserving of compassion just because someone else is going through something else worse. And this is where I'd say that the way you should think about your own struggles is to like really, really prioritize them. And I know it sounds weird, but when people are going through a war, this is where everyone who has it worse than you needs you to be the best that you can so that you can help them, right? If someone is like drowning, if you can stand on firm footing and hold them, that's way easier. That's a way better chance to help another human being than if you're treading water, right? When my feet are firmly planted on the ground, I can hold someone up. But when I'm treading water, it's so much harder to help another human being. And so this is where I'd say like, you should prioritize your struggles. I'm not saying that you should do it to the exclusion of helping other people, but this is where I want you to understand that you have a responsibility to the rest of humanity to get your shit in order. Because like, we need you. The human race needs you. So get your shit in order as quickly as you can. You don't need to be ashamed about it. You shouldn't invalidate it. And at the same time, like, you need to get it taken care of. So do what you need to. If that involves seeing a therapist, if that involves meditating every day, that involves adjusting your diet, going for long walks, journaling, whatever. If it involves getting a job, it involves moving out, if it involves becoming financially successful, whatever it takes, you should prioritize yourself first and foremost. And as you prioritize yourself, recognize that the world may need you to help it. But as long as you are treading water, you don't have much to offer. Right? You can offer something. And that's where like even things like our community is really important. Like you can offer something, even if you don't have your stuff together. You can absolutely support someone else on Discord. You can absolutely, play video games with someone. And by the way, there's also a really interesting study that shows that playing Tetris after a traumatic experience actually can have positive effects in terms of trauma symptoms. Right? So like it could be as simple as gaming with your friends, right, who are going through a tough time. Like there's a lot of ways you can support people. So I'm not saying support other people, but it's very important to not deprioritize yourself just because some faceless person out there is struggling in their life. That's why we need you to get your stuff together, right? That's what this community is about. It's about becoming healthy. Because like that's the only way you can help other people, right? Like you have to have capability, you have to have power, you have to have strength, you have to have resilience. Then you can help the world. Great question. Does getting involved with the MMO guild count as getting involved with the community? I think to a certain degree, absolutely. Right? So there's some research that shows that like online communities can be a healthy source of support. And I've even seen like, I don't know how true these are. I've seen like, posts from 4chan and stuff about people forming deep connections with people in developing countries and like playing games together and stuff like that. And I've heard a lot of stories about online communities being toxic and being the reason I'm stuck in life because I got lost in my WoW guild. I've seen relationships get destroyed through MMO communities, like real life relationships. I've seen divorces happen. I've seen parents get frustrated. I've seen people fail out of school because of MMO communities. And I've seen the opposite. I've seen people wake up every day and have something to look forward to. It's the one bright point in their life when they're going through something bad. Their parents are going through a divorce. Mom or dad is an alcoholic. It's the one safe place that I have, and it can be both. So like most things in life, online communities are a tool. And it is our choice as a community what kind of tool we want to be, right? Do we want to be a health pot or do we want to be a poison potion? Do we want to engage in toxicity or do we want to engage in support? It's our choice. It's just a tool, just like anything else. Is the internet a good thing or a bad thing? Is social media good or bad? There's tons of studies about negative effects of social media. And social media can be a huge force for good. So it's down to you. right? Okay, so this is a good question. So someone's asking, how do secondary engagements make disengaging stress responses worse? So let me clarify. Secondary engaging responses and disengaging responses are two separate things. They don't make, what they make worse is the stress response column on the far right. So secondary engagement is adaptive things. So it's dealing with the thing directly, but in an adaptive and macro way. So it's like making sense of my traumatic experience is a good example. Disengaging responses is not making sense of my traumatic experience. It's ignoring my traumatic experience entirely, right? It's like pretending it didn't happen or engaging in wishful thinking. So cognitive restructuring is an example of a secondary engaging coping strategy. And avoidance is an example, avoidance is an outcome, but denial is an example of a disengaging strategy. So cognitive restructuring and denial are two very different things. And it seems like secondary engaging strategies, adaptive coping strategies, are good at reducing things like numbness or re-experiencing or things like that. Whereas disengaging coping strategies seem to make the stress responses actually worse. Good question. So someone's asking, do you believe group therapy is better than one-on-one therapy? No. So I think that the two things are different, right? It's like, is an apple better than a banana? No, they're just different. So oftentimes when I've worked clinically, like there'll be patients who will have group and individual therapy. The two are just different. So it's like, is Elden Ring better or is Lost Ark better? Well, maybe you can make a comment. You could make a judgment there, but this is where like the two are just different. They can actually be complementary. So I'm gonna share a question that I see on stream, which, how can Ukrainians abroad not go mad worrying about their families? I don't know, right? So this is one of the times where I'm just gonna say, I don't know. I have no idea. If you are a Ukrainian and you are worrying about your family, like, I think that's normal. Is it driving you crazy? I imagine. Right? And so this is where I'd say, like, as best as you can, lean on whoever you can around you. Share your thoughts with someone. So there's a really important saying we have here at HG, which is don't worry alone. So I don't know that we can take your worries away, but hopefully what we can do is help you not worry alone. So you don't have to be alone in it, right? We can't I can't wave a magic wand and make anyone's family safe in Ukraine. I wish I could. But the most we can promise you is to like not worry alone. And that's what community is about. So besides avoiding exposure to trauma, how can we do primary prophylaxis to prevent the development of PTSD? These coping strategies sound like treatment in response to after getting PTSD. So not exactly. So let's understand this, okay? So there's treatment for PTSD. So PTSD is a mental disorder. It's a diagnosable clinical illness, post-traumatic stress disorder, that has certain evidence-based treatments. So what we need to understand is that outside of the clinical diagnosis, people experience traumatic events and cope with those traumatic events. So that happens to like everyone, right? Like, so even minor traumas exist. So if I go to school, for example, and like I wet my pants, that's a minor traumatic experience. And depending on how I cope with that, I may never develop PTSD, or I could develop PTSD, who knows, right? And that's the key thing, is what you do after the trauma, how you deal with that to a certain extent determines whether you develop PTSD or not. So this is where people are sort of saying like coping strategies sound like treatment in response to PTSD. So that can be true. So we can teach people. So part of the treatment of PTSD is like developing healthy coping strategies. So especially like in terms of addictions, right? So people that wind up with me are oftentimes using an unhealthy coping strategy like a substance. But this is where like I want y'all to understand that trauma is more than a clinical illness. Like trauma is like a biological experience, a psychological experience, a human experience, that bad things happen to humans. And the way that we respond to those bad things, the way that we deal with those bad things can determine how stressed, what the degree of our stress response is to the trauma. That's the big takeaway. So sure, it could be a part of treatment of PTSD, but the whole point is that like whether you have PTSD, whether you get PTSD or not, appears to a certain degree depend on how you cope with what happens to you, how you find meaning, how you deal with your emotions. Do you avoid? Do you integrate? Are you safe? Do you engage in community? Do you forgive? Do you hold on to anger? Do you seek justice? Do you get justice? All of those factors go into whether someone has a clinical illness or not. And this is sort of what was bizarre, right? Is like I have patients in my practice who have had traumatic experiences but don't have a diagnosis of PTSD. Right? That's possible. And so the cool thing is that the research seems to be elucidating what are the things that go into whether you wind up with PTSD or not. And that's where there was one thing that I sort of didn't feel ready to talk about today, but like was thinking about talking about it later if you guys are interested in this. And that's where, so there's a really interesting area of research called post-traumatic growth versus post-traumatic stress. So this is where depending on a shared event, like a common event, it seems like human beings will deal with that event differently, and one will lead them towards post-traumatic growth, and one will lead them towards post-traumatic stress, which is the way in which you respond to the event. And that, in turn, has to do with coping mechanisms. It also has to do with personality traits and characteristics. So the research behind post-traumatic growth is very interesting. So maybe we'll talk about that. What do y'all think? Poll, post-traumatic growth versus stress? Yay, nay? So this is another great question. What if it's really hard for me to manage with stress? Like there is war next to me and I have to pass school. How am I supposed to do both things at once? Friend, I have no idea, dude. Honestly, like, I have no idea. Oh, no, I can't do it now. I mean, do you guys want to do it at all? Because I need to prepare, especially with the personality aspects. That's the one area that I don't feel. I want to do a thorough literature search. So just to give you guys like a quick example, I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I reviewed 19 papers, like 17 or 19 papers in order to give this talk. So we looked at like a ton of research. So I've only read like 5 papers on post-traumatic growth. So I don't feel like I can accurately represent it because I don't want to misrepresent things. Going back to the question of what if it's really hard for me to manage stress, like there's war next to me and I have to pass a test, do the best that you can, right? So this is where I'd say like meditate if you can, take a walk if you can, acknowledge your feelings, maybe do some emotional expression, and then do the best that you can. This is also where I know it sounds kind of weird, but like sometimes you have to accept that if in a particular circumstance, you're not gonna be able to do well, right? So I think this is where, oddly enough, I'd try to forgive yourself for not being able to study for your test. And this is where I'd also say, like, concretely, like maybe talk to your teachers or parents and say, hey, I tried really hard to study for this, but I literally like could not sleep last night and I'm terrified of what's happening nearby. Because I can't imagine you're the only one, right? So this is where like it's important to make allowances for yourself and to ask for allowances from other people. Someone's asking, what do you do with national guilt? I have no idea, man. That's beyond my expertise. Okay. All right, shall we meditate today? Okay, so we'll try to do a post-traumatic growth stream. Okay, so we're gonna do like super simple. Yeah, I assume yes. I feel like we should. So we're going to do like super simple meditation today. So for anyone who's joining us, who sees this, right? So we're going to get a different population. I want to teach y'all a very, very basic meditation technique called Nadi Shuddhi or Nadi Shodhana or alternate nostril breathing. Or recently in the scientific literature, it's been called cardiac coherence breathing. So this is a breathing technique that has been shown to balance your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So your sympathetic nervous system is your stress and survival system. Your parasympathetic nervous system is your rest and digest system. So if you're amped up, this will kind of calm you down. And if you're feeling tired or exhausted, this will, hopefully a few minutes after doing it, kind of revitalize you. I really sort of fell in love with this technique when I was working with people, physicians and other emergency room staff. So in the emergency room, I would teach meditation, not to the patients, but to the clinicians and staff. And what we sort of found when I was talking to them about what would be the most useful, and they would sort of say that, okay, so in Bay 1, I have someone who just came in after a motor vehicle accident, adrenaline through the roof, paddles, chest compressions, blood transfusion kind of stuff. And then in room number 2, I have a little old lady who has, been nauseous and has a GI bug. And like, I need to like reset from the adrenaline to being like compassionate. So I need some way to like balance like my adrenaline. So this was the technique that I sort of used. It worked really, really well. I like this technique because you don't have to do it for long. So you can do it for 2 or 3 minutes and it tends to have a pretty good effect. If you're new to meditation, it's very, very easy to do. The one contraindication is a deviated septum. So if you have a deviated septum, this technique can be hard or even impossible to do, and I don't recommend doing it. So the technique is actually quite simple. So we're going to sit up straight because anytime we want to meditate, we want our spine and neck to be straight. So you can even meditate on the ground if you want to. You can lay down, lay flat, but we try to sit up straight. We're going to take our hand and we're going to fold these 2 fingers down. If that's hard for you or it ends up like this or something like this, that's totally fine. Okay? And then what we're going to do is block one nostril and breathe in through the other. And then we're going to block the other nostril and we're going to breathe out through the opposite nostril. And then we're going to breathe in through this nostril, switch and breathe out, breathe in, switch and breathe out, breathe in, switch and breathe out. So after we exhale, we're going to inhale through the same nostril. And the nostril that we breathe in from is not going to be the same nostril that we breathe out, okay? So it's in, out, in, out, in, out, okay? So I'll toss in the switch. So in, switch, out, in, switch, out, in, switch, out, okay? So it's also common for one of your nostrils to be more clogged than the other at any given time. It's very normal. So one of your nostrils will be more open, one will be more closed, and it'll alternate over time. So every 45 to 90 minutes, it should switch. Okay, so let's go ahead and practice. So sit up straight, close your eyes, or you can watch me if you need to. We're going to adopt the mudra. If this is hard for you, you can also just use your index finger to switch back and forth if that's easier. So we're going to block our right nostril and breathe in through our left. Switch and breathe out through your right nostril. In through the right nostril. Switch and out through the left. In through the same nostril. switch and out. In through the same nostril. Switch and out. In. Switch out. In. Switch out. In. Switch out. I'll guide you through one more round. In. Switch out. And now continue at your own pace for a period of about a minute or two. We'll continue for about one more minute. Go ahead and finish the breath that you're on. Let your eyes remain closed. Relax your hands. Make sure you're sitting up straight. And just float in this space. When you're ready, go ahead and come on back slowly. So I know the world can be a scary place, but as best as we can, we're going to try to stay positive. It's totally okay to acknowledge the fear, the hopelessness, the terror, the uncertainty of the future. And yet the most we can do is live one day at a time. So that's what we're going to do. Reach out for help or support if you can. And for people in our community, be prepared to support those and help those who ask for it. And in terms of practicalities, if you're learning this technique for the first time, I'd recommend start with 5 minutes of practice. And you want to eventually work your way up to 10 to 20 minutes of practice per day, or 3 times a week at a minimum. You can try other things in addition to this, so you don't have to do 20 minutes of Nadi Shuddhi. You can do like 5 to 10 minutes of Nadi Shuddhi and then do a different kind of practice, like a mantra practice or chanting practice or even silent meditation, observation of the breath. The goal is to really shoot for about 20 minutes of total practice. So you can even do yoga for 10 minutes and Nadi Shuddhi for 10 minutes if you want to. And so that's what we sort of recommend. In terms of time of the day, I think dawn and dusk are ideal, but oftentimes people find that doing it sometime in the morning or sometime before bed can be very helpful, depending on what you're shooting for. So if you're having difficulty sleeping, doing meditation maybe about half an hour before sleep can be really good. If you want to start off your day sort of in the right mindset, meditation first thing in the morning can be really good. But remember that this technique is actually particularly useful because it can be used midday if you want to try to calm yourself down or bring yourself up. Okay? So I hope you enjoyed the technique. I hope it's helpful for you. And remember that practice makes perfect, that meditation, just like anything else, is a skill. So even if you didn't have a wonderful experience this time, the more you practice it, the better you'll get at it and the more mental benefit you'll get.